afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on basic sociology, in today's lecture we are going to understand the relationship between caste and discrimination in Indian higher education. We are, for the reference to the lecture, we are referring to Professor Satish Deshpande's article, Exclusive Inequalities, Merit, Caste and Discrimination in Indian Higher Education. Now, we know that there has been a certain kind of exclusive inequality in the education system, and what is to be understood that despite the abolition of untouchability and caste based discrimination, how is it that the difference or the dominance of the Hindu upper caste is a part of educational system. And to understand that Professor Deshpande is examining the meaning of merit, merit discrimination, resource discrimination, and also looks into the examination system. How the examination system is a cultural capital of the upper caste, and this is what the students from marginalized community lack, and therefore their performance in the examination could be colored by the caste to which they belong. So, first we will understand merit discrimination and resource discrimination. What is merit discrimination? It is a form of discrimination where it is done on the basis of how much merit a person has, assuming the precondition that everyone has equal opportunity to acquire it and favors those who have more of it. So, merit is that you are kind of are judged in terms of your knowledge and skill. Now, your only performance in a particular examination is taken into account. How the individual has reached the exam room is not taken into consideration. So, that is resource discrimination. So, if there are two students, one from an say poor family versus a child from a rich family, the poor child may not have access to the same amount of resources for preparing for any kind of exam, and therefore you cannot kind of compare the merit of the two on the same ground. Merit discrimination is discrimination in principle, and resource discrimination is discrimination in practice. So, Professor Deshpande argues that merit discrimination is considered legitimate and desirable, while resource discrimination is illegitimate and undesirable. Resource discrimination is that the particular individual, because of the birth or belonging to a particular community, has been denied or discriminated for having access to the resource, and therefore it can be considered as illegitimate. Now, higher education is a kind of a resource discrimination, where because not all who are kind of being entering the education system have access to the same kind of resource. So, higher education tends to be associated with resource discrimination, that is discrimination born out of inadequate endowments of the resources required to access and succeed in higher education. Deshpande emphasized the pervasive nature of caste-based discrimination in higher education, and this education as a resource discrimination takes several forms. Number one, it can be an overt discrimination. So, some students from marginalized caste face direct hostility and prejudice from peers, teachers and administration. So, that is everyday interaction, they are kind of being stigmatized, or they are feeling of getting some kind of notion of belonging to a subordinate or a lower category. The second form of discrimination is subtle or systemic discrimination. More insidious forms of discrimination embedded in the institutional culture of many higher education. So, students from reserved category may also be excluded from the informal network of support, mentorship, peer collaboration. So, these discrimination are inbuilt into the system, and these are resources which are necessity for success in higher education. The third form of discrimination is social alienation. Now, because there is a kind of everyday stigmatization, labeling, and the system is kind of not ready to accept, there are large number of marginalized students who kind of feel alienated, and they kind of cut off, they don't interact, they kind of are not able to build up peer groups, and therefore this it leads to the issue of social alienation. Now, if we kind of have understood that there is discrimination and higher education is a form of resource discrimination, we need to understand the nature or the way in which higher education kind of is situated in a country like India, which is big and poor at the same time. So, in the recent year, if we see the trend, the affluent section of the elite, who are called elite or majorly larger upper caste and upper class, they have seceded from school education long ago and are now, so they don't send their children to government school or public schools. They have their own community school which kind of have students from their similar background, and therefore the kind of education is completely different from the kind of education that children from lower economic class and caste are getting. Now they have also kind of started sending children abroad for higher education. So, most of the children who have the access to go to other countries than India to achieve higher education, if we look into the background, majority of them are from upper caste and upper class. Now, despite the fact that higher education is entirely state funded, and very recently there has kind of the privatization has started, but it was dominated by the state funded institution, it still it kind of does not attract the elite class. It is still the middle class which kind of uses this state funded education system as an avenue of mobility. So, you can get higher education, ensure that you get a government job, or you can improve your income of the level. So, this has become a middle class phenomena, and they are still tilted towards the upper end of the status hierarchy. Though they have abandoned state school, they don't send children to the public school or the government school, but yet when it comes to higher education, the tilt is a large majority of the middle class upper caste Hindus opt for the state funded education. The problem is that the number of desirable formal sector job is always much less than the number of job seekers. So, India is kind of a populated country, and with a large population which is kind of still falls into the middle class or in the poor class. So, there is a kind of a huge demand and supply shortage, and therefore applicant have to constantly seek to improve their credential. They have to kind of be a part of a very competitive examination in which they kind of to work to at every angle to ensure that they are able to get it. One consequence of this feature is that it is counterbalances the special claim made on behalf of higher education because of its responsibility to pioneer cutting edge research for the future. To the extent that higher education functions as an avenue of mobility, it must be subject to the social justice or other obligation imposed on public institutions. So, at the level of the individual, if we try to look into the education and aspiration for mobility, the one of the inherent function of higher education is to ensure individual attainment. So, you are able to attain a higher degree, and therefore, it is kind of a set which you can move upward it is necessary for upward mobility. So, individual constantly seek to improve the credential to compete for a limited number of desirable jobs. This leads to credential inflation as more degrees are acquired. Higher education must accommodate these aspirations due to prevailing market and social conditions. So, the jobs are declining, the competitions are becoming more tough, and as a result we see a number of coaching institutions comes in, and there is where the poverty or the economic caste and poverty or the economic status of this community comes in, where members of the marginalized communities do not have the purchasing capacity to pay for these coaching and these extra classes. As a result, their performance is affected, and therefore we need to understand what is merit. Definition of merit in the context of higher education in India refers to a certification of competence, aptitude or knowledge acquired through an examination. So, whether you have the merit or you do not have the merit will be certified through an examination. Now, what goes in terms of preparation of the examination is dependent on your location, your identity and your economic status. It is often determined by the relative rank obtained in examination. So, merit is determined by the rank you obtained in the examination compared to other candidates. So, if we take in for example, the UPSC conducts the civil service examination, and depending on the rank you are kind of allotted your the sector in which you will work. So, when we look into this definition of merit, we see there can be kind of several ways in which we interpret the meaning of merit. One is symbolic meaning of merit. So, merit functions as an entitlement and moral claim on society. So, once you have cleared an examination, you are certified as eligible for a certain job or for a certain post, it becomes your entitlement. You are able to express your worth, your identity, your capability through the certification. So, so many a time we hear it among our families and friends that if a child has cleared say the Indian Institute of Technology exam after class 12, he is termed as a meritorious student. However, it is not necessary that scoring a certain rank in an examination necessarily defines your merit. Merit, but most of the time in Indian higher education, acts as an expectation or a demand. So, you need to clear this such and such examination is a expectation from say the parents, from your teachers, and there is a demand. So, the child is obliged or an individual is compelled under the demand to show his or her worth by clearing the examination. So, at the denotative level, that is concrete literal level, merit usually refers to a certification of competence, aptitude or knowledge acquired through an examination. In most instances, what is actually involved is the relative rank involved. What really matters is not really how well one does in the exam, but how much better or worse one does compared to others taking the same. So, it is a question of relativity. You must have learned or done your lessons very well, but someone other does better than you, so is considered to be more meritorious than yours. Whereas, if the other person has done better, is not only his or her individual contribution, it is the society to which the individual belongs also contributes to the success. Now, when we look into merit, and we have been saying that the certification of merit comes from examination. So, what is the role of examination in terms of strengthening inequality? In entrance exam for professional educational institution, getting a high rank is critical for admission. The number of meritorious candidates is predetermined based on the available places, and the exam is used to identify them through ranking. The exam generates inequality by ranking candidate along a continuous scale, but the cutoff point creates two distinct groups, meritorious and without merit. So, those who are able to get above the cutoff are considered as meritorious, and those who are not is kind of considered without merit. So, remember the line, just say 0.1 or but a small margin, the person falls into the other category, is considered as not having merit. So, there is where there is a necessity to look into the subjective meaning of merit. The examination also serves to functions of saying no to a large number of candidates. At the connotative level, that is the symbolic, figurative and ideological level, merit functions as a kind of entitlement, a moral claim on society. It is simultaneously a claim in the sense of an assertion about myself, my capabilities, my competence, and at the broadest level, moral worth, and the claim in the sense of an expectation or demand addressed to the rest of the world. Merit at this broad symbolic level functions as the raison d'etre of the examination. So, merit functions as an entitlement and the moral claim of society. It asserts one's capability, competency and moral worth. It also acts as a expectations or demand. So, in higher education is the exclusion of certain individual. The combination of examination and merit serves the purpose of justifying and legitimizing this necessary exclusion. So, all the members across the caste will write the same examination, but the preparation for those is kind of different. Now, though that is not taken care of it, and only those who kind of cross the cutoff are considered as meritorious, and in that much of the would be in terms of those who had the privilege to get access to the best of study material, the best of teachers, the best of schooling, and that is kind of a long history. So, examination actually differentiates candidate without explaining the meaning of this differentiation. So, you are going to kind of legitimize differentiation, ignoring the differences through which the candidate are writing the examination. Differentiated ranking is the primary requirement, not the explanation of the meaning. Examination produce cutoff and decimal point differences to justify claim about merit. Reliability and validity of entrance test, examination rank method is considered unreliable. It is difficult to predict aptitude or likelihood of success through test. Examinations bear the moral weight of merit, but are inherently arbitrary. Opposition to reservation or similar proposal should consider the arbitrariness of examination. This is what Professor Deshpande is arguing, that before we kind of come to the conclusion that a reservation is no longer necessity, we need to understand the meaning of merit, how examination is arbitrary, how the preparation for the same common exam is not necessarily egalitarian, and therefore, there is kind of lot of also discourses which we have to keep in mind in terms of understanding the arbitrariness and moral weight of merit. There are a lot of emotive language like murder of merit suppresses the knowledge of the arbitrariness of merit discrimination. The extent of compromise with merit in a reservation scheme is an empirical question. It involves considering the difference in marks or rank and its impact on the quality of candidate. The argument that access to higher education is solely based on merit is flawed. Three types of resource contribute to exam result that indicate merit. One resource is your economic resources. The second is social and cultural intrinsic ability, and the last is your hard work. Now, all three resources have to work together to ensure the performance in the examination. Now, the skewed distribution of access to higher education can be understood if we look into the resources which are available to the candidates who are writing the examination. And this skewed distribution tells us that there is a dominance of upper caste, and this cannot be attributed solely to intrinsic ability. Inequalities in economic and cultural resources contribute to intercaste differences. And therefore, we kind of refer to Mark Galanter, who points out three kind of resources which are necessary to kind of understand the result, or whether we kind of term someone as meritorious or not. And the economic resources which the individual has prior to entering an educational institution for acquiring the training, material, freedom from work, your psychological satisfaction is important before you can really physically work hard. Social and cultural resources are network of contacts, confidence, guidance and advice, information, etc. So, this kind of material, non-economic resources kind of plays a very dominant role, because you have to be in a certain physiological and psychological state of mind to write an examination and perform well. So, if that is lacking, the performance will get affected. The third is intrinsic ability and hard work. It is some combination of these that allow people to acquire merit. Now, through the discussion, Professor Satish Deshpande discusses the idea that the idea of meritocracy itself is a myth. So, merit in higher education is often socially constructed concept that benefits the already privileged upper caste. Examination system do not take into account the historical disadvantages faced by lower caste, such as lack of access to quality primary and secondary education, economic hardship, and even the physical and physiological labor that kind of leads into, and the discrimination which is kind of not only in the field of education, but in the healthcare, in the basic necessity, and this together works to kind of exclude these individuals from the system. Upper caste students who have greater access to resources can often perform better in examination, but this does not mean that they are inherently more capable or deserving. So, we have tried to understand the problem, and in this article he concludes, Professor Deshpande concludes by giving certain recommendations for change. He suggests several ways to address caste based discrimination. So, kind of how as sociologists we can re-examine the issue and ensure that the system functions in the more positive light. The first suggestion is strengthening affirmative action. He advocates for a continued and strengthened commitment to affirmative action policies, including reservation for marginalized caste in both admission and faculty recruitment. He also suggests that these policies need to be supplemented with support system to help students from disadvantaged background succeed once they enter higher education. So, it is not just kind of giving them reservation or giving them certain kind of number that these are the numbers that can enter. What is required is the preparation, and therefore, rather than reserving at the higher level, this reservation has to start right from the primary level, where they are then prepared and trained to write the examination at the same level as the members of the upper caste. The second reform suggested is curricular reform. Deshpande calls for curricular changes that addresses the reality of caste-based inequality. This includes incorporating discussions of caste discrimination and social justice into the curriculum, as well as creating more inclusive and academic environment. So, it is not that this group has to be separately treated. There has to be an awareness among everyone in terms of the discrimination, inequality faced, and therefore, it has to be an inclusive academic resource. The third recommendation is sensitization and awareness program. He recommends that higher education institutions implement sensitization program to create greater awareness about caste-based discrimination and promote inclusivity. The fourth is faculty, administrators and students need to be educated about the ways in which caste influences academia and social life. They have to be represented in decision making, and this includes that ensuring that more members of the marginal community are hired as faculty members and administrators. So, we have tried to understand the problem and also look into the solution of addressing the problem of inequality in higher education in India. For reference, the article is Satish Deshpande, Exclusive Inequality, Merit, Caste and Discrimination in India, in Indian Higher Education. The article was published in Economic and Political Weekly in 2006. So, if we refer to this, we will have a good understanding of the lecture. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.